So, welcome back to another episode on the Sino-American lens. It's been a while. Midterms have been painful, but we're back with Mike, and we're going to talk about, the wildfires and the overall situation that California has been in the recent weeks. And we'll kind of freestyle from there and see how it goes. So, I have a few questions prepared, and we can kind of talk through it. That's how it's going to work. And I guess we'll start now. So, our first question is kind of like the main thing. What factors do you think led to the fires spreading so quickly, and how it reflect climate change conditions?
Yeah, so I mean that's a good question. I think, maybe the biggest factor in all of this was that it was kind of an unprecedented combination of a bunch of different sort of things that happened at the same time, right? Yeah. Basically, they had something like 6 different fires that were happening all at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so they were fighting fires on 4 different fronts. And so even with a normal amount of water, it would have been very difficult for them to fight these fires, right?
Yeah.
But for a few reasons, it was especially difficult, or it made the situation especially dire. The first reason was because there's been historically low rainfall in Los Angeles this year. So since October 1st, I read that they've received 0.16 inches of rain.
Damn, what? Okay.
Which is 3% of normal rainfall in Los Angeles during that period of time.
So
just as... go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. That's insane. I read about the drought that's been going on in Los Angeles. I didn't realize it was 3% of what it should be. I mean, with that and the Santa Ana winds and how powerful they were, especially at this time of year, and how kind of rapid, like you said before, how many fires there were. I mean, of course, it's a perfect storm for these type of fires to happen. I don't think it should have lasted weeks. I think there's definitely measures that the government could have taken, or local stations could have taken. I don't know what they are. Like you said before, these fires are crazy. 3% rainfall is absolutely absurd. That's just completely, that shouldn't happen. But yeah, I feel like it being such a big fires, being so many big fires, and California having, I would say, the resources to try to fight these in a better way. I would hope that this issue gets resolved in a week or so, instead of lasting the weeks it has right now.
Yeah. Well, just to kind of go back to that point about 3%, and 0.16 inches, I was reading that's the equivalent of turning on your water faucet in your sink for 1/10 of a second.
Oh.
So think about how little rainfall that is over the past year. But to make matters even worse, they had a historically high amount of rainfall last year, which, one of the results of climate change is that there's more climate variability, right? Mm-hmm. So there's increasingly extreme weather. So there's hotter weather, but there's also drier weather. There's wet weather. I mean, warmer air carries more moisture. So sometimes you get lots of rain. Sometimes you get very little, right? And so in this case, we kind of had the perfect storm of consecutive years of, a lot of rain followed by a super, super dry year. And so there was a lot of fuel for the fires to burn. Like you said, the Santa Ana winds were obviously the X factor in all this too. It's they make it really difficult to fight fires, and they were really, really strong in this case. I don't know if you saw any videos, but if you watch some videos of people as they're leaving their houses, I mean, it's crazy how fast it spread.
2 things. I would say the winds themselves, over 100 miles an hour. That can't be good for 6 different fires at once. Plus, especially in recent years, I would say rainfall has been crazy. California hasn't seen crazy or a large increase in rainfall, And I'm sure that, a sudden drop off, especially with this magnitude, 30%, once again, is still crazy to me. Imagine, I'm sure, it wouldn't help, the authorities, the stations, the firefighters themselves, knowing that this is such, this thing shouldn't happen, such a random occurrence, and it's so out of the ordinary. It's just, yeah, I'm sure they weren't expecting this, and I think that could be a reason it's taken so long for it to, calm down. It's still going on, so it's what can you really do?
Yeah. Well, you make another really good point. I mean, it seems like even with all of these crazy circumstances, it's still astounding to think that fires could burn for as long as they did, right? And so I think one thing that has really struck me about this whole situation is that it's been very interesting to see how much of a blame game there is going on in the U.S. right now.
Yes.
You have a lot of finger pointing, right, of people saying, well, it was the budget cuts that happened to the fire department, or, the local leadership failed in this case, or, there's stuff about it was that they focused too much on social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion, or, that the power companies should have turned off the power lines, and that anyway, there's a lot of blame going around. And I think probably the case is that there's probably a lot of blame that each individual sort of party in this issue deserves, but it's probably not necessarily one single thing, right? It's not that they're conducting, they're taking measures to protect the Delta smelt, which is an endangered species, right? But that may have contributed in some way, right? It may have been a factor. The budget cuts or the failure of local leadership. I think all of these are factors to some degree, but it's not really fair to point at any one of these and say that it was the main reason or was a main cause of this being as destructive as it was.
I mean, it's America. It's a typical U.S. situation. It's oh, it's your fault. It's your fault. It's your fault. And it's just well, really, it's everyone's fault. But what can you do? I would say I'm gonna add to this finger pointing here, but I would say in terms of weather conditions, especially last year, we had so much rainfall where so much vegetation was grown, so much grass, so much plants were grown in general. I'm pretty sure when they dried out due to a really lack of rainfall, I'm sure that provided fuel for the fires, and that definitely helped make them rampage across LA for such a long time. I mean this really shouldn't happen. This is California. This is one of the main exports. This is one of the main greatest cities in the world. It shouldn't fires of this magnitude shouldn't rage for weeks, but I guess so many factors, so many out of the ordinary factors came in, and it's just when will it stop? Will it stop? So
yeah. And one sort of final point on this question that I think is interesting from what I'd read was that in the first 2 days of the firefighting efforts, they had reported 48 drone incursions. Ooh. So people using their drones, so just public, individual civilians flying their drones around to take pictures or videos of the fires. Mm-hmm. And there was one case in which a drone crashed into one of the planes and damaged the plane. And so just kind of in addition to all these crazy circumstances and all these factors that were contributing, you've also got issues with the restrictions that they can place on drones flying around a natural disaster like this, right? It's just I think that to me kind of illustrates to some degree just the complexity of all that's going on and all that went wrong in this case, right? Is that they had no way to stop people from just flying their drones around and crashing into airplanes. So it just kind of goes to show how there's a lot that went wrong, and I think there's a lot that everybody is sort of looking at to try to improve to prevent this from being as bad in the future.
Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty perfectly. We need to be better. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. We need to stop flying drones into airplanes. That's pretty important. Yeah, hopefully this never happens again. Hopefully we can get things under control, but until it stops, we won't really know how well we deal with it, how efficiently we deal with it. But yeah, for now, hopes and prayers to anybody in the fires who've been impacted by the fires. I hope you guys do well, do better, and yeah, that's kind of it. Okay, so next question. So, how do you think like the recent like fires have impacted like local communities in terms of like displacement, infrastructure damage, or, like public health in general?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say in terms of displacement, the places the areas that were affected the most were mainly areas where there were a lot of, most of the people living in those areas were pretty affluent. And so I would say that it's different than if a natural disaster were to happen in a place where, so maybe marginalized populations lived, or people who, had lower, didn't have as many resources. Obviously, these people have lost everything in terms of what they owned, their physical possessions. I don't mean to downplay the significance of like someone losing their home, whether they have a home that's worth $5 million or a home that's worth $50,000. Losing your home is a terrible, terrible thing, right? But I think in terms of displacement, the biggest problems are going to be more longer term, in the sense that all of a sudden you have 10,000 homes that have been destroyed. And a lot of those people are now looking for places to rent, which is causing rental prices to increase from, by 15 to 20% or even more in some places, right? And so the sort of ripple effect of all of this is rising rent costs for housing in other parts of the city, right? And which can have an effect on people across the spectrum, from like, less expensive places to live all the way up to more expensive places. Obviously, we're more maybe concerned about the people on the lower end of that, right? If someone's rent goes up by a large percentage and it's a very expensive place to live, I guess it's maybe not as big of a setback as it is for someone who's maybe living in a place that they can hardly afford their rent as it is. And so it sounds like restoring the city's lost housing stock is likely going to take somewhere between 3 to 5 years, according to real estate agents. So it's going to be a long-term thing, right? And so the displacement issues are not necessarily like, homeless shelters being overwhelmed. Obviously, LA has a homelessness problem in other parts of the city, but in this case, it's more a matter of like there's already a housing shortage, and then you have 10,000 homes that were destroyed. Now you're going to have the sort of ripple effects of that for housing costs, for rental costs, for other parts of the city.
Yeah, I think we said it's all true. I would say like they're pretty lucky, especially like the economy in general, especially in California, where most of the homes destroyed were from like very rich people, from like very affluent families, and they could afford to like kind of live without, or like kind of rent out places where they're not like entirely impacted. They're not like instantly screwed because their family because their home is gone. Of course, like it's a horrible thing. It shouldn't be understated that 10,000 homes being destroyed is a horrible thing. I don't think we're trying to downplay it, but the fact that like it's from families who have just like consistent high income, they're able to kind of replenish themselves a bit faster and a bit better off than like lower income families. I would say like, of course, like I said, the housing market's a big thing, but I would say like there has to be some like firings or some blame given to like government, right, or something like that, because there's no way like this event, this tragedy that happened is going to go unnoticed from like local authorities, local officials. Like, of course, they said like they're going to give $2.5 billion in funding to like the areas, but still, like I would say like a pretty big impact, especially like directly after is like some sort of firing or like some sort of mass firings and some sort of local authority or some sort of like riots or something like that, just to make sure this thing never happens again. Once again, this is it's a tragedy, right? But like, yeah, I would say that something's gonna happen and something has to change.
In terms of, you mentioned in your question infrastructure damage, right? And I think this will probably end up being the most costly or most expensive natural disaster in U.S. history. That's because of the scale. Obviously, like a huge number of homes were destroyed. They were also just like much more expensive homes than if you took 10,000 homes from, another part of the country, right? And it's significant in the sense that Los Angeles is set to host the World Cup in 2026, the Super Bowl in 2027, and then the Olympics in 2028. And the Los Angeles Olympics organizers had sold the Olympic Games as being what they call a no-build event. So, with past Olympics, a lot of them have been very costly because the host cities have had to spend a lot of money to build new facilities, and then oftentimes what happens with those facilities is they don't really get used, right, after the Olympics. I think one example could be, I love the Olympic Park in Beijing. It's one of my favorite places to go, but there were a lot of facilities that were built for the 2008 Beijing Olympics that are not useful to Beijing anymore. Same can be said about the 2022 Winter Olympics. I mean, the ski areas are certainly useful, but the ski jump, I don't know if that's going to be super useful for the future, right? And so I think one thing that California has going for it is that it has a pretty strong track record of rebuilding after major natural disasters. So earthquakes are really big in California. There were huge earthquakes in 1906, and then there was another major earthquake in 1994. And California after those earthquakes, California made extraordinary efforts to ensure that its buildings could withstand future earthquakes, right? And they've rebuilt in multiple cases. So those are certainly sort of things that I think give people hope, is that maybe with that, like you said, $2.5 billion that the governor is requesting, maybe they'll be able to rebuild in a way that prevents this type of stuff from happening again.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much like the best answer possible. I would, of course, like the major events happening. It can't look good for your city to like burn down a year before any major events, but yeah, I mean, I trust its track record. I think California, it should be able to rebuild pretty quickly. It has it's such a hub of like social media, such a hub of like initiative and like basically just technology. I think it'll be fine in the long run, but it's just like, why did this happen? This really didn't need to happen. It's kind of just like that. I would say, like, of course, the main thing is like houses burning down. I think like the costs that it takes to repair them might hit America's economy or California's economy a bit, where it's just like, where did $2.5 billion go? What happened to it? And it's just unfortunate that maybe that funding can't go to like things that could have been used for better things. Basically, it could be used for homeless, could be used for anything else, but it has to go to dealing with the consequence of your own actions. But yeah,
that's a great point, because LA has a huge problem with homelessness.
Yes,
and it's certainly a major blow that instead of putting $2.5 billion towards resolving that issue, you have to put $2.5 billion towards rebuilding areas with lots of multi-million-dollar homes that were there before, right? It's just the allocation of resources. It unfortunately takes resources that could have otherwise been used for those types of purposes, and they have to put it towards something like this.
Also, like, the math just doesn't add up. Like, most of the homes are like 5+ million. 2.5 billion is like half of those homes. Or like, how's that gonna work? Are like half people that just like not gonna have homes?
Well, I think, it's not necessarily that money is going to go directly to
Sure.
the people and to the families or to the people who own those houses. Presumably, a lot of the people who lived in those areas had some form of insurance, right? In which case, the insurance company would then be responsible for some sort of payout. But it is true that in the months and years leading up to this disaster, some of those homes became a lot more difficult to insure, because the insurance companies recognized that they were built in areas that were at high risk of possible forest fire, or wildfire, right?
Yeah.
Damage. And so, it's not necessarily that money is going to go not to rebuilding homes per se, as much as like rebuilding the infrastructure for these areas, or $2.5 billion. Some of it might go to installing some sort of pumping mechanism so that in the future they could get water up into the hills to fight these types of fires, right? So the $2.5 billion would be directed more towards sort of public utilities or public sort of facilities, I guess. And then in terms of, private property or property that was lost, that would be more sort of an insurance issue.
Yeah, I just completely forgot about insurance for Luigi. But yeah, I think that's probably the way they're going to do it. Yeah, I think it just makes sense, kind of. Well, yeah, okay. That works kind of perfectly. Insurance companies are going to die, but it's fine. It's really not fine. Okay.
Well, I mean, I think there are probably going to be efforts by the local government, the state government to create some sort of, these are obviously private companies, the health insurance company or the insurance companies that provide the insurance for the houses. And so it's, their decision whether or not to offer policies, but there may be an effort to prevent these insurance companies from dropping policyholders, because presumably in a lot of instances, there were people who had insurance on their houses in these areas, but then lost that insurance coverage, and then now they're in a world of hurt because their house burned down and they don't have any insurance, right?
I mean, yeah. I think like the long-term effects of a disaster like this are gonna be like more prevalent like 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, when like we see the homes trying to be built, like the companies, the insurance companies, like the construction companies, where they're like asking and praying for money because of the tragedy that happened and like the loss of basically billions of dollars in like the past week or so, or weeks or so. Yeah, I feel like, of course, like the short run, like the immediate impacts are going to be felt pretty well by like, the people who lost their homes. But I would say in like 5 years down the line, we'll see what happens, but it can't be good, especially in this area where so many things have to be rebuilt, so many things have to be fixed. And yeah, it's gonna be a long journey.
It's gonna be a long road, yeah. In terms of, and sort of, in reference to longer term effects, you had mentioned in your question about public health, and one thing that is part of this whole sort of issue is that they had to issue a public health emergency because of the smoke in the air that could cause longer term health risks, especially to people who have underlying conditions. Now, I've lived in Beijing. I lived in Beijing for 8 years previously, and then I've been back and forth between the U.S. and China this year. Reading about the air quality issues, or what dangers there are from exposure over a few days, I maybe have become a little bit desensitized to some of that because I've been living in a place where air quality is a persistent issue. And so, I was surprised to hear that, air quality was even mentioned as an issue, because I think the air quality index got up to like 800 on the day of the fire, but it was down to like 400, the day after that. And then it was down to 200 or 100 the day after that. In Beijing, the day after Chinese New Year, after everybody blows off fireworks, I've seen it get up to 1,400. So, I guess my feeling about it was, yes, I understand the concerns about, public health and risks of smoke and, air pollution. But I would say that generally those are issues that are caused by longer term exposure, not necessarily one day of being exposed to smoke. That's not to say that it's not bad. It's certainly bad, right? And I don't mean to downplay it, because it's not good to be exposed to air that's that dirty. But I would say, to me, that's pretty low on the list of sort of things that I think people should be concerned about in relation to this disaster and the longer term effects.
I'm gonna disagree with you here. I lived in California for 8 years. When I first moved to Hangzhou, it was like 150. I could not breathe. So, maybe you're used to like the Beijing air. I used to live there as well, but I kind of forgot about it. But when you're in California, a place where like the air quality is phenomenal year round, and suddenly spikes to like 400, 800, yeah, you can't breathe like in 2 days. So it's like, if you get used to it, you get used to it. Of course, it's going to be bad, but like to a certain extent, when you're used to something being so great and then it suddenly just crumbles almost instantly, I think like you're going to feel the effects a lot more, especially if you're so used to a place like California.
That's a good point. Yeah, and certainly for people who are used to or accustomed to air quality being in the, maybe 50 or lower, spiking to 800 is certainly going to be quite a shock.
Of course. Okay, so moving on. Like, what measures do you think have been taken by the state or like authorities to kind of help those in need or help those who have been affected by the fires?
So you mentioned earlier the $2.5 billion in funding that the governor of California plans to request to assist with emergency response and help in funding the rebuilding efforts. So that's one, I think, big part of this whole sort of the recovery efforts and what measures are going to be taken or might be taken. In the immediate aftermath, I think that people in the affected areas were given some FEMA aid. It's only really, I think it was like $800 or $1,000 or something to cover, basic expenses. Because of course these people lost everything, right? And they need to buy clothes, they need to buy toothpaste. I mean, they have to buy basic things and they may not have anything, right? Yeah. And so that was one sort of immediate piece of support that the federal government gave. There was some talk in the immediate aftermath of some possible threats by now as of last 24 hours, President Trump to possibly withhold aid from federal aid, to withhold federal aid, because certainly Trump has a tense relationship with California Governor Gavin Newsom. So, and just with California in general, obviously, like Trump and California are not very politically aligned, to
oil and water, basically.
Yeah. So, in that sense, there are some concerns about continuity, I guess, of the federal support, but it doesn't seem like that. I mean, there's so much going on with the Trump starting his administration that I don't think that that's ultimately going to become an issue. I think that probably they'll continue to provide whatever federal assistance was provided before, because I think the focus is on other things, executive orders and other things. Yeah. So, but I think that those were some of the main pieces of initial support was the support from FEMA for just basic sort of living essentials. And then it looks like maybe, some money that would come in the form of federal and some state support to rebuild.
Yeah, it's just money, hope, and prayers, basically. So I think hopefully California gets actual money to help rebuild, especially like the more public things like schools, like libraries, stuff like that. That'd be like a main focus where insurance isn't like that prevalent there. I'd hope it gets rebuilt pretty quickly, especially with like the addition of money, the addition of support. I think it should work out pretty well, but only time will tell, I guess. Okay, moving on to I guess this is probably worse. It's fine. Okay, so in light of the destruction caused by the fires, what do you think we could do to prevent things like this from happening again? To make sure California doesn't experience fires to this extent again?
So that's a great question. I think, in some of these discussions about sort of how to respond, I think that there are a lot of people who are talking about, what are some of the ways that we can ensure that, that if something like this were to happen again, in terms of the sort of crazy set of circumstances with the drought following a year of heavy rain, and then, the reservoirs being dry and everything. I think there are things like possibly building pumping systems that could make some of these developments up in the hills safer. I think there'll have to be a conversation about should there be so many houses built in some of these areas, right? I mean, there are certainly going to be a lot of people who decide to move back and rebuild and repair what life they had there, or rebuild what life they had there. And I think you'll see a lot of people make some extraordinary efforts to to come back and to rebuild and try to create something similar to what they had before. But I think you'll also see a lot of people that are probably going to come to the decision of, it's a beautiful place, it's a wonderful place to live, but it's just not safe, right? And it's not safe to live there if they can't ensure that they can receive, the protection from these fires, right? And so I think that you'll see changes in building codes, permitting. I think that there will be maybe more restrictions on whether or not people can build in some of these areas. Yeah. They've got to balance that with some of the issues of, they're having the housing shortage in California, Los Angeles. But I think that there's going to be a lot more consideration given to is it safe? Is it safe to rebuild in these areas? Because we saw the destructive force and the destructive nature of this, sort of this crazy set of circumstances, right? And there's no guarantee that it won't happen again. In fact, it's likely to happen again because of factors like climate change and just the increasing climate variability and all the stuff that we talked about before, right? And so I think there'll just be a lot more consideration given to what's safe, what can we manage, what can we, rebuild, but what do we also need to sort of take some precautions to ensure that, something like this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. I feel like people will be a bit more pessimistic, a bit more paranoid about things like this happening again, and I think from there might be safety protocols, let's say that might help construction companies, might help policies, might help authorities to make sure that the house is actually safe, the land is actually safe. And I would say a big part of that is making sure there's not so much feel around the area. Like, of course, there's gonna be trees, but like even then, the amount of dried up vegetation that was basically perfect fuel for fires. I feel like getting rid of that, or at least taking that into account when like building homes, is very important. And I think if, especially like last year's rainfall made for so much vegetation, and then this year there was like nothing. So I think like the dried up plants, they provided so much fuel for the fires, and I feel like if that was removed and if that was regulated, I think we would be able to have a safer environment where more people could, of course, live, or more people could feel safe in. But yeah, I feel like overall, it's going to be a bit more paranoia, a bit more pessimistic family owners or house owners. But I feel like, yeah, I feel like in the long run, this will, I wouldn't say help, because that's really downplaying like the effects of the fires, but I would say this would help with policies in America, or sorry, California, especially concerning fires and safety concerns in general. Okay, yeah, I think that's pretty much it to that. One last question. So, how do you think the current wildfires like influencing discussions around climate policy and environmental regulations in California and beyond?
So on this question, I think that people's views on climate change are fairly set. And so in the U.S., I think you have a lot of people who think that climate change is happening and it's a big issue, right? And I think that you also have a pretty large cross-section of the country that believes that it's not happening, or that it's not an issue, right? And I mean, we just saw today with Trump's, first executive orders. One of them was to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords, right? And so, and then if you go back, there's a YouTube video from 2020 where Trump was talking to, I think, some fire response personnel about fires, a separate set of fires in California in 2020. And he makes some comment about, well, science doesn't know about climate change, or he says something like, it's just going to get cooler, like you see, right? So we know where Trump stands on climate change and his views, and a lot of the people around him maybe don't believe that climate change is happening, or if they do believe that it's happening, they don't believe that it's caused by humans, or they don't believe that it's a big threat, right? So I guess what I mean to say is, I think that people who believe that climate change is happening already see it as an existential threat and an urgent threat, right? And so I think that those people, certainly I think that seeing something as visible as 10,000 homes being burned to the ground, I think adds even more urgency to that sense that it's an issue and that it needs to be addressed. But what I mean to say is that I think there are also going to be a lot of people who just don't really view this as a climate issue. They view it as a issue related to building codes, or just sort of a crazy set of circumstances with the weather and the rainfall and a dry year, right? Yes. And so in that sense, I don't think that it'll have a major impact on climate policy. I think that we're probably in for, probably 4 years at least of an administration that doesn't really view climate as a major issue, certainly compared to the Biden administration, yes. Right? And so I think as a result of that, I don't think this is going to have a major impact on climate policy or environmental regulations in California. I think that those sort of are already big issues to the people who think that they're big issues, and they're not big issues to the people who don't believe that they're big issues.
I really want to disagree, but I don't think I can. I think it's really hard to convince people that climate change is actually happening when they have had this opinion for a decade now, where it's oh, it's not true. It's just freak circumstances, freak accidents. It's just it's the government's fault. It's the protocol's fault. It's It's the hill's fault, it's the grass's fault for being alive. It's everything else besides climate change. So yeah, I would feel like convincing them with this type of tragedy, this type of accident's not gonna happen. But I would hope that like at least some protocols in California are changed. Like of course, if like the governor, if like top officials have the ability to not change anything, I don't think they would. Like there's no point. Maybe they would make sure it's safer, but besides that, it's like, oh, this was a crazy year where we had no rain, we had really dried out vegetation, we had crazy powerful winds. This probably won't happen again. But I feel like there should be some steps where it's like, okay, we can build in these areas where there's so much vegetation and there's a high likelihood of fires breaking out. And I would hope that California kind of regulates where homes and structures are built to make sure that stuff of this magnitude doesn't happen again, and this amount of damage, this amount of money or resource spent on something like this doesn't happen again. But yeah, like you said, I think the people who believe in climate change are gonna continuously believe in it, and the people who don't just won't. And that's kind of reality. So yeah. And that's my last question, basically. Are there like any experiences, any other thoughts on the wildfires in LA right now?
Well, I think this has been a great discussion. It's been great to hear your perspective. To hear what you're reading about and your views on the whole issue. I mean, neither of us lives in Los Angeles, so we're sort of viewing this from afar. But I think it is interesting to think about kind of in our own lives what are sort of the most sort of biggest, the biggest threats that we face from climate change or from natural disasters or anything like that. And so, looking at what's happened in Los Angeles, I think, makes us think a little bit more about like, okay, well, what do I need to be concerned about, right? I grew up in Idaho, and wildfires, forest fires are a really big issue, and they've become bigger issues in recent years. And so that's something that's a little bit more on my mind. It's like, is my family prepared for if something like this were to happen where I live, right? And so, I don't know for you if there are sort of things that you think about in relation to climate change or possible threats to your safety that could come from some sort of natural disaster.
I mean, yeah, I have like friends in that area. I'll probably call them later and make sure like they still have homes and they're not homeless. But yeah, of course, like this, I think once again, this type of accident shouldn't happen, and the fact that it did is like kind of needed for change, and something needs to happen for this to never happen again. I mean, yeah, of course, like wildfires in California, they've been pretty rampant since forever, basically, and I feel like the fact that it's like usually put out, like stopped pretty quickly, and there's like not that much damage being dealt is kind of gave us like a safety blanket, kind of gave us like an attitude where we just didn't really worry about it, and it should be worried. It's especially in California, the winds, they're super powerful, and the amount of vegetation, the lack of rainfall sometimes is just, it leads to huge fires. But yeah, I mean, hopes and prayers to anybody living in Los Angeles. Hopefully you guys were impacted by, these crazy fires. And yeah, I think on that depressing note, I guess we'll end the episode. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for tuning in. Hope you guys enjoyed our interesting takes on these devastating news. And yeah, thank you.